Hi, this is Rainer, founder of the Mindful Leader and host of the Mindful Leader podcast. I'm happy today here to have a special guest, Katrijn van Oudheusden. And this will be a very, it's a special episode around really going deeper into leadership. In the past few weeks, months, I have talked a lot about mind management. I've talked a lot about biohacking stuff, upgrading your mind, high performance mind. So a lot of those topics in all, of course, relevant to leadership, but now really going also deeper into different types of leadership. And I'm sure that many of you listening to this podcast have heard about the idea of servant leadership, sometimes also called selfless leadership. And that's why I'm really happy here to have Katrijn here, because she's an expert really on this topic. She really has focused in and really zoomed in on this idea of selfless leadership, servant leadership. She is author of the book on this topic as well, on selfless leadership. She is executive coach. She runs the website with all the details of selflessleadership.life, which we'll link all that stuff obviously in the show notes. And I met Katrijn about I think a year ago. We talked about, there was some conference going on, so we had some exchange, and it became clear that this idea of selfless servant leadership, in my opinion, is already also a little bit more advanced topic for leaders to really get going onto this. And there is, so as we start talking about, you'll see there is some symptoms around, is a leader ready for this? So we'll dive into this topic as well. And we'll also look a little bit about the effectiveness of it. But of course, there's always trade-offs. We know about that. But all those things we'll find out soon in this episode. So there will be a lot of practical and actionable advice that you can try out for sure. So I'll make sure that we always have some actionable stuff in there. With that said, I would say then welcome again, Katrijn, and glad to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me, Rainer. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, I'm as well. So maybe, Katrijn, we can get started. Maybe first share a little bit about your own story, what brought you here, basically going back, and what got you in this whole topic of servant leadership or selfless leadership.
Yeah, so I've had I guess you could say, very traditional career, in the sense that I studied law, and then I spent 20 years in organizational development positions, different versions, moved from law to project management, and then from project management to change management, organizational development. And I've been in different roles. So I was a staff member to the board, to the executive board, chief of staff in healthcare and in universities, but also external management consultant in the area of change management and organizational development. And over all this time, I learned all the classical tools and ideas and mechanisms for cultural change management, but also, of course, leadership development, because that's a big part of improving organizations. And this was all very normal. I think most people would yawn a bit, but it wasn't that successful, as we know about change management. Lots of initiatives, lots of stuff going on, but not a lot of effect. And the same happened in leadership development. So there were many initiatives, programs being set up, especially as external consultants. We were always creating new leadership development structures. And then something happened in my personal life. So it was more that I went through a personal, private transformation, you could say, in the sense that, we'll talk about this later, I guess, insights about who am I as a human being, what is my true self, what is my ego, ultimately answering the questions also, why am I here and what am I doing at work? And this personal transformation, at a certain point, it moved into my work, because of course we're people at work as well, we're human beings. And it became clear that as human beings trying to work together, we're most limited by our egos, by our concepts of self, the defectiveness, but also the grandness, the arrogance and the self-defectiveness that most people bring as human beings into the work environment. So it became much more clear to me that the failure or the lack of change and leadership development had to do with this basic problem of seeing ourselves as separate, limited egos stuck in our little bubbles and projecting these limits and beliefs onto our work environment.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, and that can cause, obviously, that can cause a lot of problems if there's too much ego in the work environment or too many egos in the work environment. That can lead to quite some toxic work environments, which I've been through. So I'm
yes, we
very
all have
familiar with all this stuff. Very good. So there was a transformation that you described there. And then, yeah, how, just to get a sense of how did this transformation affect you, or how did it work out over what kind of time frame, and what was then the outcome?
I guess we could say it really happened over a period of almost 10 years. So it was quite long. And but it started when I did an intensive with somebody called Byron Katie. She works a lot with limiting beliefs. And in this intensive, I really saw for myself that the things I believed about myself and consequently about other people's were just constructs in my mind. So you talk a lot about mind management, and part of that is also seeing these limiting beliefs and letting go of them. And this was really what I saw very clearly in that workshop. 9 days actually of questioning limiting beliefs. So this created the first opening really to see, okay, if there's limitation, I'm doing this to myself and other people are doing it to themselves. And following that, I started reading and practicing more and more in this area of non-duality. And non-duality is actually a perennial philosophy that you can find in all wisdom traditions, whether it's Buddhism or Sufism, most form the core of world religious traditions. But they all say the same thing, and that is that the separate self is an illusion. The ego is a construct and an illusion, and what we really are is universal consciousness or awareness. And reading about this, doing practices that help us see this for ourselves, created over these many years, and I can't give you an exact moment or this is the aha or where it happened, but allowed me to see to a certain extent, okay, I am not a separate self. I am universal awareness, as you are and as we all are.
Yeah. Yes. I think the first point you talked about Byron Katie, and yeah, I also really like her work. It's very effective, and it's working on limiting thoughts, false beliefs, but also later on reactive patterns that are based on those is a critical part of what I refer to as mind management. So it goes well beyond meditation. And people always think, oh yeah, meditations and mindfulness, and then we'll add it to leadership, but it's actually much more, right? And I'm glad that you actually bring these topics up. So they're all part of actually how to upgrade your mind. And then the illusion of the self. I mean, that's for most leaders who are new to this topic of maybe heard about mindful leadership, and then they're hearing about this illusion of the ego. This is obviously, when I first heard about it, it was quite advanced and something to grasp. But is it something how could you describe it basically for people who are really new to this idea of wanting to get into this a little bit more, could it be described as applying less ego to leadership, or what would be something to simplify the concept of non-duality?
So the analogy I like most, because it's so present to us now, is the hardware-software analogy. So you could say that basically we're hardware, a body and a mind, the brain, including and an operating system. And over the course of our lives, and this starts when we're born, or maybe even before that, we don't really know. But the whole operating system is extremely powerful and is all about learning and developing. So a baby, from the time it's born, it starts assimilating and internalizing beliefs, facts also, reality, and okay, if I touch fire, it'll hurt, things like that, but also beliefs about an identity. So we start to form this identity. And the fact that a baby or a small child needs to learn that it is an identity, that it is a self and separate from others, already gives us an indication that this is a kind of like an app that downloads itself onto our system and then starts referring to itself. So these self-referencing thoughts, this is like a new app that installs itself on our system, and over the course of our lives gets bigger, more concrete, often clearer, but it also changes over time, because there were beliefs that you had maybe when you were 10 years old that you don't have now, or you won't have in 5 years. So this construct, you could really compare it with a bunch of software on your system. Now, the thing is, what we try to do, if we know about this self, or in our society, we learn to create a strong individual self-construct. The whole process in school, at work, our parents, society are about, okay, become a beneficial, effective individual, improve yourself, learn new things, become more confident. And the flavors are endless of what is the right answer to this becoming a good person, a separate self. But it's all a process of learning and becoming. Now, the thing is that we can come to really see in the sense of experience that this is a construct. And this allows us to go beyond it.
I like the analogy. I also used to talk about brain, hardware, the mind, software. The ego is like the output of it. So it's very similar. And I like in this scenario, yeah, so that means the self, what you believe that you are, the ego, the egoic mind, the story of your life. So that seems like it's basically an app that we have downloaded in very early ages. And yeah, it's interesting to see, right? When babies are still like, even before or maybe just when their turn become toddlers, you notice that this at some point there is this, oh, this is mine, right? So when you give them some toys and then they want to play, and then some other kid comes and try to grab the toy, and then, oh, it's my toy, right? And then they start to fight around this. So this is when you know the ego is there. It's already uploaded, but I like this. There's a software that is then basically accumulating stuff, and it's getting bigger and more. It's like this becomes this monster at some point, this monster piece of software. So that means non-duality, achieving a state of non-duality, is basically getting rid of this piece of software, or at least make it slimmer.
No, see, that's important to distinguish, because as we might talk about this in a second, but what we think is that we're the software developer, that we're the software engineer, and that we can go in there and rewrite the code. But the point is that all of this is happening by itself. You didn't download the app installed itself, and this app runs itself, and there is no software engineer.
So okay, that now it gets interesting, right? So as an engineer, obviously, I understand now there's this app, it even installed itself without that I actually wanted to have it, but I simply get it, which I don't actually like, right? That someone
it has advantages, right? I mean, a sense of self is also needed to manage life. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there is benefits to the app. So that's why I said earlier, probably not getting rid of it might be what's needed, but making it slimmer, making it more effective, and just to the bare minimum of what's needed to navigate life, right? But it looks like it's something, what you're saying, so you're not the software engineer who now goes in and now takes this app and starts to I don't know, debug it and improve it. So how do I get it slimmer?
Yeah, so the point is we can't do anything. And this is the most counterintuitive of four insights that I have for this selfless leadership, which is the first one is we're being lived. And it says that we believe that we are in control. So part of the app that installs itself is also a belief in not only a self, but a belief in control and responsibility. So I make decisions, I decide to go to university or not, I decide to take up a new position, etc. So we believe in this control and responsibility. However, if we look directly with practices and with exercises, we can see that this is part of the self-illusion. So not only does the app create a sense of self, it creates the illusion of doership, of authority, authorship. It's actually called the false sense of authorship. So we can come to see that not only is there no software engineer, we're not able to remove this app or decrease it or make it less heavy. None of that is possible. But what we can do, interestingly, is that by seeing this, by going outside of the hardware software system, because we are more than hardware and software. And that's where it's get interesting, because if we can make this increase in awareness and perception, we can see how the system, how the hardware software system works. And it is through the seeing, through the awareness, that it becomes less dense and less relevant and less inflated.
Very good. And Will, I actually wanted to do deep dive in some of those topics. There's a lot of interesting insights. So for the audience, I encourage you to, if you have a chance now, to rewind about 2-3 minutes and listen to this part actually again, because this is a very critical insight that awareness, the ability to observe, actually observing the app and understanding what's happening there is basically helping to minimize or mitigate the impact, which is a very interesting concept. So you don't even have to rewrite some software here, but it's awareness. But before we go in, I wanted to talk a little bit more about awareness, and I wanted to go into those 4 areas that you mentioned earlier. And of course, they're part of your book, the book, what I mentioned at the beginning about selfless leadership. Going a little bit back here first to on a high level, I think let's talk about first leadership concepts that people can see how this actually then ties into the leadership. There is, when you go into the literature, there's all different types of leadership models out there that people studied in science, in all kind of business schools, and there's plenty of books on that out there. A few years ago, when mindfulness was emerging more and more in the workplace, I remember it's probably about 4 years ago. At that point I had experimented with many years of applying mindfulness in the workspace, and I coined this term for myself, and I put it on my blog some time ago: mindful leadership. And then I would say maybe 6 months, 9 months later, all of a sudden people were talking all about mindful leadership. So it became this trendy term, and more and more also about mindfulness and applying it to the workspace. In parallel, that term servant leadership has been used a lot, and people wanted to become servant leaders. So there's a little bit of context here. Maybe share just from a high level first about what you think when you hear about selfless leadership or servant leadership. How does this relate to mindful leadership, or in general other leadership models? So just to see from a positioning standpoint, why should we care about it as leaders?
Yeah, so that's a big question, right? And we can talk for a long time about different leadership models. I think you already, the example of mindful leadership is a good one. So there's, it feels like this is increasing in pace, right? There's a new type of leadership every month now. So there's conscious leadership, there's mindful leadership, there's empathetic leadership, and all these different flavors. The one that we're talking about today, servant leadership, is actually also very old, but it was reintroduced as a concept by Robert Greenleaf in the 70s. And this was from a very, you could say, Christian background. So it had a lot to do with being in service to the world, following the example of Jesus even. So it was quite Christian. At the same time, there's a whole, you could say, aspect of Hinduism, for example, which is about selflessly serving others. That's part of doing good works, karma, yoga. So these aspects are also centuries old. But servant leadership kind of came back onto the scene because of the whole agile movement. So the Agile manifesto, it's not in the manifesto, but Scrum masters and others, leaders in agility, are defined as servant leaders. So they put others first. That's kind of the short version. They put others first before themselves. And in the meantime, there are also studies on servant leadership. These are of course observational, or they're not quantitative, they're qualitative business studies, usually often done by schools, business schools with this background in servant leadership in the Greenleaf version. And what they do show is that this type of leadership is actually what we're all talking about now as so beneficial for organizations, because it puts people first. It increases intrinsic motivation, it increases high performance, it increases how people feel, the sense of belonging in a culture. So all these things that we're looking for now, servant leadership could be seen as the solution to that. But the reason I call it selfless servant leadership or selfless leadership is because I don't believe in this iterative developmental view of servant leadership. So it's a moralistic idea. If you become a good person, if you train yourself, make your ego very small and smaller still, then one day you will wake up and be a servant leader. My approach is kind of the opposite. It's what we are, our true nature is already selfless and is naturally in service. So it's a process of discovering this beyond the ego and beyond this app that has installed itself. And then we find that we already are this and have everything we need to be selflessly in service, which is the type of leadership that I call the highest form of leadership.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you hear the term selfless leadership, there is also on the flip side, right? Then it seems like, oh yeah, this is this kind of weak form of leadership. I often heard like arguments around this. Can you elaborate a little bit? Is it really a weaker form of leadership? Are you still a good leader if you're that weak and there's no ego left? And maybe share your opinion here.
It's a common misconception, because it's absolutely not the case. So we're not, first of all, we're not getting rid of the ego. This is something that keeps coming up. We're not removing an app, we're not making it lighter. We're seeing that we're more than that. So what happens is, if you see that you are not limited to the separate self, you see that it's a construct, you become automatically less interested in it. So selflessness is not in the sense of I am now unselfish, which is the moral version. Selflessness is literally I am without, or I see through myself. Because I see that, I'm less interested in myself, and I'm able to and want to be in service to others. So it's very much about, it's not removing, it's seeing. And that means that all the skills and all the qualities that you have accumulated so far, your intelligence, your skills, your capabilities, they don't disappear. But they are now no longer in service to my own self-interest, because that is not that important anymore. but these skills and qualities you put naturally in service to the world.
Yes, yeah, that's a good insight in there as well. Now thinking about then the advantages on this, right? So leader could say, well, I'm doing this particular whatever leadership style. I read some books about it. Now I heard about servant leadership, and you already mentioned some of the concepts that belong to this. But what would be a motivation then for a leader in terms of what would a leader get out of it?
So on a high level, this is the most meaningful and fulfilling type of leadership or form of leadership, because what we really want as human beings is to be in service to something more than just ourselves. This is if you look at the pyramid of Maslow or any type of motivation and intrinsic need, the highest is self-transcendence and being in service to others. And this form of leadership allows you to achieve that, which makes work meaningful. This is something that we all long for. But additionally, there are concrete leadership outcomes from being able to demonstrate selfless leadership. For example, if I have seen that I'm not in control or not as much as I thought I was, it is much easier for me to let go. So to stop pushing my personal agenda onto others. I can be present with what is. So it's much easier to flow with reality, this being in flow that we're all looking for, which allows me to actually work with the people that I meet and what is emerging without pushing or pulling them. So this is a style of leadership that it creates exactly this type of co-creation and collaboration that is really what we're trying to achieve when we're running after these new tools and skills. It's really already inside of us and comes out naturally when we stop believing so much in this separate self.
Yes, yeah, and so I can see that definitely makes sense. If a leader now hears this and some of these concepts may already resonate, particularly I would say a viewer of this podcast, there is already something that draws them into this whole concept of how can I evolve as a leader, or what are things I can do to improve, and what are some symptoms that you see when you start when you start working with clients? As I mentioned at the beginning, you're also an executive coach. How do you know, or maybe it's twofold the question, how does someone know that they're actually ready for servant leadership? And then when let's say someone then contacts you and says, oh yeah, I want to do it, how do you know actually that person is ready? Because that person may think he or she is ready, but may not.
Yeah, so often this searching, the people I work with, they've been through endless leadership development initiatives. Usually they've tried coaching, they've done the training, they're very interested in improving themselves, becoming better leaders. So they've usually been through this whole carousel of leadership development in the classic sense. They still feel something is missing, and often they also read a lot of books. Some of them even have programs like yourself, in the mind management area, or even more spiritual practices like meditation, because what they're trying what they're looking for is this higher level of purpose and meaning than just, okay, here's my team and let's get a high performing organization on the road. So that's this intrinsic desire to be in service and for the meaning. And it's also often, there are two types of motivations that work really well. One is, okay, I've tried all that and I'm fed up with it. It doesn't work. We're still in the same stupid organization with the same egos and it's not working. That's one type. The other is this aspirational motivation, which is there has to be more. There has to be a better way. We have to, I know I like the concepts of servant leadership. I'm interested in these ideals, but I'm not getting there. So what I offer is a different way of getting there, because it's not developmental. It's not you have to learn new skills, read new books, the whole thing that we've been doing and it didn't work. It's looking within. So really the absolute key is a readiness to be willing to look within ourselves instead of to more knowledge.
Yeah, and yeah, I've seen that also. That many leaders I work with, one told me a few weeks ago he had already read like 1,000 books as an example, and I said, "Oh wow!" So
Yeah.
that's a lot, and there's nothing bad with it. It's good stuff to basically grow the intellect, to read more stuff, to absorb more knowledge. But it's not really getting you further. It's basically the key. What you're saying is looking inside. Start to look inside, and to do that, you need awareness, right?
Yes.
Being aware to actually noticing that. And now maybe it's a good timing to talk about awareness. I use the term a lot. I talk about awareness. I talk about level of present awareness, or like LPA, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which you can actually measure that in terms of how much time of your waking time over the course of the day are you actually fully present, connected to the present moment. And so there's all these different terminologies out there, and people, when they hear about it, awareness, maybe they think, self-awareness, self-reflection, whatever. Let's spend a moment to really define this a little bit clearer. In when we talk about awareness, what does it mean?
Yeah, so this is a simple question, but it's difficult to describe in words because I'm sure you know that already, that awareness is, the way I refer to it, is basically the sense of being present and aware. So the sense of being alive, really. If I ask you the question, Rainer, do you exist? You go somewhere in your mind, or you go somewhere to answer this question with yes, I exist. It's the sense of being alive and present and existing. And interestingly enough, yes, you can increase your level of present awareness, and this has many benefits, obviously, to be more present and aware. But the way I use it in this approach is we use awareness to see things about the personal self. So it's not a state that we have to increase or deepen or expand. It's just, in that sense, a tool to see what we're not and to see what we really are. But it has nothing, it's not a meditative approach or that we need to go deeper or more. It's just what I call higher reasoning, what many people call using the mind to transcend the mind.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the whole idea of increasing the level of present awareness is more like an illustrative thing, right? At the end of the day, awareness is what you are observing, and it's basically that part, right? Or that, from a functional standpoint, there is something that recognizes things like, now let's say you're listening to this podcast or actually viewing the video. Who is viewing this video? Who is listening to this? And so awareness itself, can't be at that point manipulated. It's not an object, can't be increased, decreased, or whatever. But illustratively, it can be quite helpful to think about this ability, actually being able to observe, because usually your focus or your attention, which awareness, it looks like for me always, there is this awareness is this capability, and it likes to attach itself to when anything comes up. It can be a thought, it can be something around you, some noise, whatever it is, it attaches and then gets thought into it. And so that is basically then what I sometimes refer to the monkey mind, right? Which is jumping your awareness back and forth with all those different things. Now, why would a leader now care about awareness, right? Because if you tell them awareness is so fundamental, usually when, as I said earlier, right, they think about self-awareness, self-reflection. But why is awareness really the crucial point in this transformation, or in this in this journey of selfless leadership? It looks like without awareness, there's not much we can do, right?
Yeah, so without awareness, we're stuck in this limited separate self. So in this hardware-software combination. And awareness is that in which the software-hardware combination appears. So if we're able to, and it's again just words, zoom out and disentangle ourselves from the complete focus on ourself, on the beliefs and the identity, we can see that this separate self appears inside of our awareness. It appears within us. And that gives us access to more than just the mind, so more than the limited self. So we can really go beyond ourselves and be from that position or be from there. And this allows us, for example, just a small example, real innovation, creative thought comes from beyond the self. It arises out of, you could say, the universe or awareness. And having access to it already means you can't be completely focused on your thoughts and sensations and perceptions, because then you have no access to this new creative thought coming up, idea coming up outside of that.
Yeah. It's basically, there is on one side, when we talked earlier in this episode around evolving the mind, or I usually use the term mind management, we talked about limiting thoughts. So those are all things working inside the mind, and awareness at that point is of course also critical for actually doing this. But then it seems there is
there's more. Yeah.
more, right? There is a point in time when we can say, okay, now it's good. We have dealt with the mind, we have managed it, we tamed it. Let's look beyond, right? Now, to do this, there is in that book, what I definitely highly recommend. We'll put a link in the show notes for those who are interested or possibly even ready to make this jump, so to speak. There is 4 insights that you're talking about, and I think we wanted to go now into each of those 4 insights just a little bit, so people get a sense of what the book is about. And in each of these insights, there is also these practices that one can do. So maybe describe the journey if someone now says, yeah, this is great, I want to try this out, I want to get going. Maybe share the high-level approach of those insights and the practices, and then maybe we can pick the first one and jump right into that.
Yeah, so we discussed the first one already a little bit, which is the insight that we are being lived. And all of these insights, they come with illusions that we've learned to believe. So the false beliefs around this, and the false belief around that is, well, look, you're 100% in control of your life. You're responsible. You're the doer. So this first insight is about seeing that that's not really true. We are being lived just as a cat is being catted or a tree is being treed. That is, life flows through us in exactly the same way. We're not different there as human beings. However, we have this app on top, right? Which, as we discussed, the self-referencing app that creates this sense of self. The second insight, which is kind of related to the first one, is that we are also not this set of limiting beliefs about ourselves, or any beliefs about ourselves, whether limiting or positive for us. This whole illusion of the self is a construct, a house of cards of beliefs that we slowly build up. And we can see that we can pull the bottom card out of the stack and it collapses. This is again all just analogy, because of course yourself doesn't disappear, it doesn't have to, but you see how the construct is created. So many people, and we talked about this already as well, you're stuck in these beliefs and it's possible to go beyond them. The result of seeing these beliefs insights 1 and 2 is the third one, which is that we're really all connected as human beings. Because if I see clearly that I'm not limited to a separate self, that is just an app running on my software, then I can see also that I'm in permanent connection with everything around me. And so are you, and so is everybody else. And so this is actually a concept that in quantum physics is now, it's not really in our normal everyday understanding yet, but that the universe is universal conscious awareness and not separated to individual bodies is becoming more known. And this is actually the opposite of seeing I'm not a separate self. Well, if I'm not a separate self, what am I? Well, yes, everything. There are no borders between me and you. So this is a really deep next understanding that flows from these first three insights. So then if we look at the first three, okay, I'm not a separate doer. I'm new in every moment and I'm not my beliefs, and we're all connected. Well, that means I am literally selfless. I am not a separate self, I'm selfless. And if I'm selfless, well, then I am not interested in myself. I'm free. I'm here as part of the universe universing, as a leader being in sync and in connection with everything. What results out of that? I still go to work, I'm still here, I'm still doing things. The only thing left to do is service. So the results of the first three is really the fourth insight, that we are selfless service. And it's not, that's also part of the fourth one. So it's not something we have to achieve or do or become. It's something that we see deeply, what we really are. And this leads naturally to this result of selfless service.
Yes. And now, so going into this in the first one, right, when you mentioned, we talked about the illusion of control. We are being lived as the first one. Now, in the book, then you share, and also in your coachings, right, you share 4 practices. Could we like get a sneak peek on one concrete practice, just to get a sense of how these practices work, right? Or how the motivation be. So there is practice still, right? Practice makes perfect. So even here, there has to be some practice needs to be done. And I think getting a flavor of that could be helpful for someone who is thinking about how this all works out, right? To get a sense of,
Yeah. So the first insight is actually the most difficult or counterintuitive, because we've been trained so long in this, you are a separate self and you're in control. And it doesn't mean, what we're looking at is really, are we the doer of our deeds? Are we the thinker of our thoughts? Or do they just appear? Like a tree grows a new branch. It's not because the tree decided, at least we don't think that way, the tree decided, oh, look, there's a gap here, let me grow a branch right here. It is grown, right? So it's part of the natural organic development of a tree. So the same as human beings, we have this hardware-software combination, and this thing runs itself. But we believe we're the separate person in there micromanaging everything. So I have to decide to do something. Now, here's where it's get interesting, because one of these 4 practices for this first insight, for example, is to try to find the decider of your decisions. So this is an example of something you can do right now, is to think of just a recent decision you made. It might have been listening to this podcast, right? You decided to, I don't know, look at the app, open the podcast, click on run for the session. So the question is, where did this decision come from? Not the causal, not your explanation for why you did that, but literally where in your experience did the decision arise? So usually people will say, well, the thought came up, right? The thought came up. We say I decided, but what it was, a thought emerged. There's the podcast, let me go listen. And then you did. Question is, where did this thought come from? Did you do the thought? Did you create it? Well, if you look closely, no, it just appeared. The thought could have appeared, I'll go and eat some chocolate cake. But what happened was the thought, I'll go and listen to the podcast. So it's even more crazy, because actually the actual deed of then listening to the podcast is not causally related to the thought, I want to listen to the podcast, because otherwise we would always do exactly what we decide and think. And from your own experience, you can see that at least half the time you do something completely different. So this is the type of exercise that starts to show you how this self and sense of doership is constructed.
Yeah, that's I like this example. And so just to clarify here, so a thought pops up about, oh yeah, let's listen to this podcast. So that's the thought. It came up from somewhere, who knows? Randomly, it just popped up. And now the decision, is the decision at the end then also a thought?
Good question. Yes, so if you look closely, because it's actually the case that you do something, or to be more precise, your body does something, namely listening to the podcast. This might be, there might be a thought in parallel, well, yes, I decide to listen to the podcast. But in many of our activities, there's no corresponding thought at all. We just do stuff. So it's only when this personal self narrates our already happening actions that we believe that we made a decision. So just because I say to myself, as I've learned to do, well, yeah, and now I'm deciding to listen to a podcast, has no relation to the fact of whether we actually do or do not.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one.
Yeah.
I'm sure for some of the listeners, right? Because so I could see that a thought emerges, let's listen to the podcast. It could be another thought, what you mentioned, that, oh yeah, that sounds interesting. Or another one could be, no, I'm too busy. I have so many other things going on. That's a waste of time. So there's multiple thoughts popping up.
Yes. And then what you finally do can be something, it's totally, it's not under your control. It's not you who decide, because how often do you think, well, yes, now I'll listen to the podcast, and then you end up doing something completely different.
Right, exactly. So whatever actions they happen, somehow they happen. The question there would still be then, is there still someone, something is deciding what that action is, right? So you get all those signals in, and they could be even contradictory. Some, as I said in this example, some say, yeah, listen, maybe something else, don't listen. Or maybe there's no thought at all. But then there's always a next step. There is now something for here, very concrete. I have to go to my, let's say, my smartphone, or I go to a computer or whatever. I basically click some button to start or select the podcast and click play, right? So that needs to happen. So is it a random action at the end of the day, or is there still there has to be some decision logic that kicks in to actually trigger the finger to physically press on this, right?
Yes, the same decision logic that beats your heart, that digests your food, that grows a tree, that makes a cat say meow and not woof. It's the same, it's the decision logic of life. But we have created a separation. So we have created a ghost in the machine. The machine runs itself, hardware, software, genetic factors, how your experiences as a 5-year-old, your last experiences of listening to podcasts and liking them or hating them, all of these millions of variables, all interacting, right, in a quantum universe where everything is interrelated. But no, we say, oh, I'm a little ego. I control this decision. It's because I think I want to listen to a podcast that it happens. So seeing this clearly is the ultimate humility. Your ego simply becomes, it doesn't disappear, but it becomes much less, it automatically, becomes much smaller, because you see that you're not this separate little control thing doing stuff. You're being lived.
So how could someone who got motivated now to try this out later today, how could someone go about it? Should basically someone sit back, meditate? Should someone do a hike, think about it? What's the best way to tackle this practice?
Yeah, so this particular practice, I mean, the thing is, the 16 practices I have and the insights, they build up on each other. So it's not, you know, you need to have a good sense of what you are beyond the mind, this awareness, to be able to do these practices well. So that's why it really requires a bit of preparation. On the other hand, the way to do all of these practices is to observe. So it's really a dispassionate, using awareness to dispassionately observe what is happening in your experience. And at first this uses the mind, but eventually actually go beyond the mind to observe the mind. So it would be, for example, during the day, this particular practice, I recommend that you set a timer, for example, and on the hour, every hour you go back and see, okay, what decision do I want to examine? Maybe, for example, listening to the podcast, or just, it doesn't matter whether it's small or big, to really look in a almost scientific way, you know, how did this happen? And by looking directly, you prove this to yourself. So it's not because I just told you this and it sounds interesting. Yes, you need to hear it first, this alternative point of view, but then you check for yourself in your experience. Well, yeah, how does it happen for me? And it's this that proves this stuff to you, not because you read it or you like it.
It's experience. Now, since we only have a few minutes left, you offer I think 7-week program where
Yes.
you work with people who are interested on this topic one-on-one. And you'll go through those 4 insights, through all those exercises, as far as I understood, in these 7 weeks. Now, what are some of the participants, once they actually were able to go through, what's the experience, how this impacts their life, their impact on leadership? And maybe related to this, is there success for them indeed, that when they go through it, that there are changes based on that? So what's the feedback basically from people who already been through this so far?
Yeah, so what happens very quickly, and that's mainly because of this first insight, is that the stress and the anxiety of constantly wanting to improve yourself and becoming, it falls away. Because you see there's no doer, it becomes much more relaxed. And a relaxed, non-anxious leader is a good leader. So it's definitely helpful. And this happens almost immediately. The effect on other people, as we discussed also before, you stop pushing your agenda, you stop trying to change people, which we all automatically do as long as we think that that's how human beings function, right? So you see that other people are also being lived. You stop trying to do things to them because you know they're also just the hardware-software combination. So the whole thing becomes a lot more relaxed, mindful, respectful, a co-creation situation where there's true collaboration. And these are really short-term benefits. Longer term, as we go through the program, what people report is for each insight, there are different aspects of this selfless service that come up. So the feeling, it's not a feeling, actually, it's the wrong word, the sense of being connected to everything. This allows you to really to stop judging other people in the sense of, are they for me or against me? Are they following the agenda that I want or not? It's okay, we are all interrelated, interacting all the time. Well, this is exactly how to promote something like an organization, to ensure that it works well together. We need to have this sense of connection. So these are more like the longer term effects. And the ultimate effect, of course, is that I am able to be selflessly in service to others without having to become a new person to develop my character or to get a new job, just as I am, but having seen these truths about myself.
I think people probably particularly then enjoy the being less stressed, or
Yes.
letting go of, oh, I don't need to do all that stuff. It's all this control illusion. Let's forget about it. It all happens. So I can basically sit back and put less tension in things and let them unfold. So I think that one probably is already very attractive
Yes.
results for many people.
Yeah, because the people who come to me, they're idealists. We're idealists. We want to make the world a better place and to be in service. And this often we put huge amounts of stress on ourselves to try to achieve this.
But then going back in terms of the success rate, right? I
Yeah.
mean, this is a journey for sure, and I know mind management itself is a journey. It takes commitment, it takes effort. Even here, it takes the effort to actually do the
Yes.
first exercise and then go through all one by one. And so, in terms of success rate, what do you see?
Yeah, so I've this particular program I have since June last year, and there've now 30 people, a bit more than 30 people have completed it. And 2 people actually had to or stop because of health issues or totally different issues than the coaching. But I've been refining this coaching program over these months, and that's precisely why it's now very specific one-to-one daily reporting on how do I do these practices? What are my insights? What did I discover? Because the key factor is, do you really actually perform the practices and how are you progressing? So if you are willing to do that, if you're willing to really look to complete the practices and to get my guidance on that, I mean, you can do this by yourself, but this is exactly where the success rate comes in. The program is so structured, so you could say rigid or so clearly, precisely because we need to also go bypass the ego and its excuses. You know, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, there was this practice, but I'll do that tomorrow. Or have you seen my agenda? You know, I don't have time to do this. So to answer your question, if you are motivated enough to really do a practice every day, that's the requirement, every weekday, spend about 30 minutes a day. And you get the guidance in coaching, everybody is able to see these things, because we're not looking at something like alien. This is the core of what it means to be human. So everybody can discover it for themselves, but you do have to do the work.
As you nicely said, your ego could be in this case your worst enemy, right? To
Yes.
procrastinate, to find excuses and all that stuff. Yeah, and that's one of the challenges. So yeah, no, that sounds pretty good in the sense that but what I hear is that most people actually were able to go through. The coaching is at the end of the day for accountability and help them to get unstuck. So that's the same experience that I have when I work with leaders. Otherwise they get stuck. So it's no way that someone can just say, oh, I'll do this all myself and I'll figure it out somehow. I think the key thing is this kind of accountability. And if things are failing, these stories that you tell yourself, these are all stories of the ego, and you may not be able to realize that unless there is someone actually more neutral and give you this guidance, right? So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
Very good. So then as we're closing, I would say for people interested to get started on this, how do you typically, so they get a sense, we'll put all those links in there so people can find you there as well. But how usually you get started, and then maybe one thing as a takeaway that you could encourage people to experiment with. I mean, we talked about this one practice, but maybe there's something else that was quite helpful for you in this time that you can share.
Yeah. So some people they want to read first, they want to absorb knowledge, and for that I try to put everything in my book. So it's the whole process that I use, and the 16 practices. You could read that, apply it, and you would get quite far. The problem is what we just discussed, that the ego will sidetrack you. It's sometimes difficult to make sense of what is happening. So that's where the coaching comes in. One of the other ways to start is I have a self-assessment questionnaire that you can complete, and it tells you sort of where am I on these different insights. It asks you to self-reflect and self-assess. And there's a possibility to just discuss that with me in one coaching session. So those are kind of the easier or the less big things than doing the whole coaching program. So it depends sort of on what you enjoy, how you like to learn and like to start new things. Many people, I myself, we needed coaching. So it's just like, okay, I can read all this stuff until I drop dead. I can read 1,000 books, but I need somebody to guide me. I think I had 2 or 3 different coaches in this process. Something you can start with immediately is this aspect of strengthening the observer. So if you do any form of reflective practice or journaling, one of the easiest things to start doing is to start journaling or reflecting in the third person. So instead of saying, I did this, I did that, this is what happened, you say the body or the mind. So you create, in the journaling process, in the reflecting process, you create distance to yourself. And this starts to trigger this, I am the observer of my experience.
Very good. So I think thanks again. This was, I think there were so many insights in there. And I think that exercise you suggested toward the end now is something people can get started to creating more distance, creating this awareness of observing. And I think there's lots of actionable tips. It's probably good to go back in this podcast, rewind and listen to it a few times. There's a lot of good stuff in there, what I remember now, right? And I think, starting getting on this process for someone who's ready is definitely it's a good option to really go beyond the mind. And I think maybe that's the motto of this whole episode, right? Really go beyond the mind. And so thanks, Katrijn, for being here, for sharing. And we'll put, as I said earlier, all those links and links to the book and everything into the show note. Thanks.
Thank you.